Archbishop Fulton Sheen once said, bringing together the beginning of the book of Genesis and the end of the Gospels, that the fall came through three realities. First, a disobedient man, Adam. Secondly, a proud woman, Eve. And thirdly, a tree. The reconciliation and redemption of man came through these same three. For the disobedient man, Adam, was substituted the obedient new Adam of the human race, Christ. For the proud Eve, there was the humble Mary. And for the tree, the cross. We can continue to draw parallels after this pattern Archbishop Sheen began for us. For instance, Christ laid in the tomb on the seventh day, the day of rest, the Sabbath day. The next day, the day after the seventh day, Jesus rose, and this has often been referred to as the eighth day. Now, eighth day is not just a Jewish pop band that I just discovered yesterday. How am I just finding out about this? No, the seventh day is a spiritual and theological expression about looking forward to what comes after our world of 7-day weeks. It's about looking forward to heaven, the day after the day of rest. Let me quote St. Gregory of Nazianzus in his oration number 44. Just as it is clear that the first creation was done on a Sunday, since Saturday, which signals the cessation from labor, is the seventh day after it, in the same way, the second creation also begins anew on Sunday, which is the first of the days that follow and the eighth after those that precede it. A day more sublime than the sublime, and more wondrous than the wondrous, for it looks to our life in heaven. So, while the Sabbath, the day of rest, is Saturday, the Christian Sabbath is Sunday, because it commemorates Jesus' resurrection and the new beginning he inaugurates. As Christians, we didn't go so far as to change the calendar to 8-day weeks. I mean, we're not 18th century French revolutionaries who, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago in a video, imposed a 10-day week. I mean, look at this. There were 9 days of work and then 1 day of rest. It's madness. But I digress. Sorry. We didn't change the calendar to 8-day weeks because it's important that the 8th day and the first day are the same. God began creation on the first day of the week, and he begins it anew again on the first day of the week. See our calendar? And once again, the world begins with a man alone in a garden. There's another level to the gospel story here, but it's going to take me a second to get there, so stick with me. When Jesus was crucified, as we follow the gospel and the stations of the cross, we come to the 10th station. Jesus is stripped of his clothing, and the soldiers divvy up and cast lots for them. This fulfills what is said in Psalm 22, and also is consistent with the way Romans tortured and killed criminals with crucifixion, that is, without clothes. The procedure for crucifixion involved this no matter who was crucified, men or women. They were exposed in an attempt to cause the most shame, the most pain, the most humiliation possible, to deter any future criminals from defying the power of the Roman Empire. Most of our artistic expressions of the crucifixion are inaccurate in this regard, except for one of Michelangelo's, who, as we know, was willing to be literal in this regard rather regularly. When he's taken down from the cross, Jesus' body is wrapped in a cloth. The Shroud of Turin was on display yesterday from the cathedral in Turin, Italy, and a separate cloth for his head. And when, on the morning of the first day of the week, the myrrh bearers came to the tomb, and Peter, they find it empty, with the burial linens still there. So, it's not just that creation begins again with a man alone in a garden. It begins again with a nude man alone in a garden. And once again, Michelangelo is more accurate when it comes to depiction of the resurrected Jesus than artists usually are. I believe that Jesus does this to depict for us in a striking way that the state of things which were intended in the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, but lost, are being regained. Jesus is regaining what was lost when Adam fell. As an aside, Pope John Paul II, in his Theology of the Body, describes that blessed state of Adam in the garden before the fall as having three characteristics: original solitude, original unity, and original nakedness, all before original sin. But in fact, there's one more detail, one more parallel that we can find to expand upon Archbishop Sheen. See, when Mary Magdalene finds Jesus in the garden, he first does not recognize him and supposes him to be the gardener. Christ is the new Adam, and so it's okay to mistake him for the gardener. Adam too was a gardener. It was Adam's job to tend and cultivate the Garden of Eden, and he did so before he and Eve fell and were sent out. But now Jesus, the new Adam, is similarly in his garden, and he is going to cultivate it, to bring it, us, new life. So it's wonderful that we celebrate Easter in the spring. The flowers are in bloom, and they are a delight to our eyes and to our noses. The plants begin to bring forth fruit for us to eat. Life seems to return in the spring. It's unfortunate that so often we are at odds with nature. Sometimes it might seem that it's trying to kill us. The cold winters, the snow, the hail, thorny plants that stab us, and poisonous berries and mushrooms and ivy that make us sick or cause a rash. Eden wasn't like this. And the new creation and the new life of heaven won't be like this. When, God willing, we go to heaven, it'll be different, but it will require adjustment. Life there and life here are generally lived differently. But why do we have to wait until heaven to make the adjustment? The Easter event, the resurrection, if it is true, means that things have changed. Things have changed for us now while here on earth. And that requires us to live differently now and reorient everything properly around that reality. So, for instance, when it became clear that the earth went around the sun and not the other way around, the old math and the old astronomy models couldn't be used anymore. They had to be left behind, no matter how much hard work had been put into them. At the resurrection, Peter and Mary Magdalene and all the rest of the disciples had to make their adjustments after first recovering from the confusion caused by it all. So it is possible. We can live, even now, as if we were already living in the eighth day, living in the new heaven and the new earth, living in the new Jerusalem. And in fact, if we put off making that adjustment, we, in effect, move farther away from that reality of the new heaven, the new earth, the eighth day, the life of heaven. Twice now, in the last year, I've had to adjust to a new way of life. First, when I walked the Camino in Spain last fall, I had to physically and then mentally and then spiritually adjust to a new way of life and a new daily routine that involved a lot fewer personal possessions and a lot more physical exertion. The second big adjustment we all have been doing together, while we are remaining distant from one another as this virus spreads. We also become particularly scrupulous with our hand washing. Different way of life. Of the two, this adjustment is harder. Our social bonds can be strained, our daily physical comforts curtailed, our income lessened, our patience tested. At least on the Camino, I could pray the Mass almost every day with people. But while there's an adjustment to this new way of life, and while we look forward to regaining a lot of the things that we did when we weren't under quarantine, we can't simply try to go back to what we thought of as business as usual. We have learned things living in this way, I hope. We've seen air pollution decrease. We've seen an increase in free time spent in ways we normally don't get to spend it, especially with our families and around the house. We've seen parents fall in love with homeschooling. I may have made that last one up. Even still, my point stands. It can be hard and painful to adjust to a new way of life, including to the life of Christ or the life of the saints who followed him. But in the end, it's a better way of life. So the only business as usual that we should be trying to get back to is life as it was lived in the Garden of Eden. But instead of getting back to it, since we've never been there, we're moving and growing towards this new life. Still, this takes a lot of adjustment to a new life, and we can't do it by ourselves or under our own power. We have to let the gardener garden us, teach us and train us in the ways of this new, yet old, and indeed original way of life. The more we learn that way of life, that Easter way of life, while we're here on earth, the easier the adjustment will be when, God willing, we go to heaven.